Welcome to Macon Memories. I'm Lynda Wright at Randolph-Macon College, and today is June the 5th, 2014. Today I'm here with Professor Willie Chappell and with Margie Turbyfill. I've done an interview with Professor Chappell before, back in 2008, one of our early Macon Memories interviews, and I interviewed you, Bill, with Professor Jerry Ross. In the context of today's interview, we are here with Margie Turbyfill to really talk about and explore the pre-ministerial programs and mission of the college. But to give us some background to the conversation, I would like for each of you to talk about your connection to Randolph-Macon College. So we'll start with you, Bill. You came to Randolph-Macon as a student and later to teach. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, I was caught in the draft in 1943 when I graduated from Jarrett High School, and within 2 months I was at Fort Benning. And so I had 3 years between my ending high school and entering college, which means that we had a lot of catching up to do. And I found out I needed catching up to do when we had our 8 weeks. The freshmen had preliminary reports, and I got mine back, and there was a D on Greek and a D on algebra. So that's when I cut out my extracurricular activities and got to work, because you had to have self-motivation. You didn't have a sergeant pushing you,
Right.
or a colonel or whomever. So I came in 46, and it really felt sort of like the Army, because we had Veterans Village then, and I was put into a barracks, the same kind that we had at Fort Benning, Georgia. 20
Right.
students, or
Wow.
40 students, however many there were, half on one side and half on the other. It looked like I was in the Army again. But fortunately, the second year I was able to go to Thomas Branch, and then to Murray Branch or Murray Kerr dorm for the other 2 years. So
So you got to move up after.
got to move up. Then I went away to seminary at Yale Divinity School, and I remember there was only one Randolph-Macon student there while I was there, and that was Bill Gibson.
Oh,
He came my second year there. He was a year behind. So Yale's kind of an ecumenical school, and I remember Dr. Moreland advised me that I ought to go to a Methodist school, because it was good to make connections.
yes.
Good
But you
politics.
But you didn't follow that advice.
No, I wanted to go to Yale. Robert Parker had been there. He was chaplain here and pastor of Duncan Memorial from 48 to 52, I think. But he's the one who told me about Yale, and names like Richard Neva and Liston Pope, and people who were known in theology. So I wanted to go to Yale. I went to Yale and came back and said I wanted to be a country pastor. And they said, well, your first appointment will be associate minister of Washington Street in Petersburg, Virginia. And associate ministers have this status of gophers. Go for this, go for that, do this, do that. And then I had a church of my own for 4 years at Ivy Memorial Church out here in Chesterfield County, right outside of Colonial Heights. And then while I was there, I was married, so didn't get any more invitations to Sunday dinner.
Oh, oh, really?
Fried chicken, and the chickens always hit on Sunday because they were a favorite in Southside Virginia. So my early ministry, the first 13 years, I was an itinerant minister, which meant it was pretty well a 4-year limit back then, or custom, or habit for the local church. In other words, if they didn't like you very well, they could get rid of you maybe after 2 years or 3 years, or if they were long-suffering, they could wait 4 years and be sure that you would leave. So I served itinerancy for 13 years, and my third pastorate was another round of associate minister with John Hendricks at Miles Memorial in Norfolk, one of the biggest churches in the conference, at least one with the most names on the roll. I served there 3 years, and by that time I came out to Kenwood Church in Hanover County, and while I was at Hanover County, Dr. Moreland wanted to take Ira Andrews and move him from teaching to being dean of students. Students were getting more abundant then and maybe a little bit more difficult to handle, not as mature as the war generation was, but at any rate we had a dean of students, and of course Ira kept on teaching for every semester. He taught one class. And then at my end of my fourth year at Kenwood United Methodist Church, I was scheduled to move to, I think it was Standardsville or something, out in the foothills, up near the valley somewhere they had a big battle, I think, in the Civil War. Anyway, my family by that time had grown to the point of 4. So we took a vote in the family, and everybody was ready to stop itinerating. I remember Bishop Gum said, I hear you're leaving us, Willie. I said, well, I didn't know I was leaving you. You're the head of the Board of Trustees of Randolph-Macon College. But that is really the ministers who are itinerant usually don't think of those who have, you might say, are located. That's an old name. I don't know whether it's still used, but it means when you're out of the flow. And they keep you out of the flow. But at any rate, I came here to teach in 67, the fall of 67, and I retired in 1992 after about a quarter of a century. And we built our home out in Hanover County, and we lived there ever since until my wife died 4 years ago.
Well, thank you for giving us that great summary, and you touched on so many important aspects of the life of the college. The veterans coming back from the war, um, your uh, your own ministry development, and your relationship with Dr. Moreland, which we might talk about a little bit later. That's interesting, and the idea that you had of seeing your teaching here as part of your ministry. And that's exactly what the kind of thing we wanted to talk with Margie today about too. So, Margie, why don't you give us a bit about your background and connection to the college, and then we'll talk about the ministry program here.
Well, my connection to Randolph-Macon, of course, as an ordained minister in Virginia, is that I always knew about Randolph-Macon and knew that my grandfather, John Walter Shackford, graduated in 1900 from the college. And in 2006, my daughter, Elizabeth Atkins Ogren, graduated from Randolph-Macon. And I told her at the time it's not very many young women who graduate from the same college that their grandfather graduated from. In 2006, Mark and I moved to Ashland just as Liz was graduating, in fact, and I took a position the next year in 2007 as the director of the pre-ministerial program known as the Purnell Bailey pre-ministerial program here at Randolph-Macon. I was the third director, even though the program was not but 5 years old. But I became the third director. President Lindgren asked me if I would take the job, and I was thrilled because I love working with college students. I had been a campus minister at Longwood College for 10 years, and before that, I served 2 Methodist appointments. Both of them were 2-point charges, so I had been in the local church for a while. Even before that, I was a hospital chaplain, so I had been involved in lots of different kinds of ministry, and maybe that was good preparation for me to be working with students, Randolph-Macon students, who saw themselves as pre-ministerial, because a lot of times the students come here not sure what branch of ministry they want to follow, and so I can talk with them about the different possibilities. But anyway, we moved to Ashland in 2006, we meaning my husband, Mark Ogren, and I. He was the district superintendent for Ashland, was the reason we moved here. And then, as I said, in 2007, President Lindgren asked me to take this job as the director of the pre-ministerial program. Mm-hmm. So that's my connection to Randolph-Macon, and I've been in this position 7 years now.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, those are long and deep connections. Very good. Well, thank you. Well, Margie, why don't you give us a bit of background, since you've done some recent research on the college's mission of training clergy and educating the sons of clergy.
Well, it's interesting when you look at Dr. Scanlon's book on the history of Randolph-Macon College. Early Methodists had real ambivalence towards an educated clergy. They were not concerned as much with education as they were with having a preacher who had passion for the gospel. Mm-hmm. So there was a little bit of ambivalence, you might say, about educating our clergy. But as laymen became more educated, there was a realization that we needed to have an educated clergy, and some of the attempts earlier to have reading programs for clergy and such as that had not been very successful. So part of Randolph-Macon's, the original mission was to prepare students for the ministry. Another part of Randolph-Macon's mission was to educate the sons of Methodist ministers and other Methodists, but it was very much a Methodist focus at the time that it was founded, and that focus has continued to today, certainly not as strong or not in the same way that it was then, but Randolph-Macon still is connected to the United Methodist Church.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a bit about the connection and how that's ebbed and flowed through the years. But, Bill, did you want to add anything about that?
Actually, I believe in the state of Virginia that a church cannot own a college. And so we have a board of trustees, and they own the college, and they administer it through the president and his staff. But Virginia is very persnickety about the relation between church and state. And we've already seceded once from the Union, and understand that some states have it on ballot already. Well, I don't see a second secession, but they, as Margie said, the church learned to appreciate having trained ministers. In fact, we had a lot of supply ministers. They were ministers who were without seminary training or without college training, even. That supplied churches and did a fine work. But as the general populace as education became more available and there was more competition for students, that happened sort of simultaneously with the GI Bill of Rights after World War II. All veterans who survived the war were given 4 to 6 years, depending on how long you had served. But more people became educated, and we had a relative period of prosperity in the country, and a lot of that credit for that went to the veterans. In fact, Tom Brokaw, famous interpreter of the news, called the World War II generation the greatest generation. I've always taken umbrage at that remark because I don't think we were any different from any other generation that came out. Maybe some more political leaders may have developed from being officers in the Army, such as Eisenhower, and Truman actually was in the service too. And so I don't know why Tom Brokaw, he was looking for a good title for his book and also to have good sales for it. But he talks more about the, people who've gone on to positions of prestige in civilian life. But yes, the church, I think, is sold on the idea now that our ministry, Methodist churches, our ministry has to be educated, as well educated as the best educated people in their congregation. And a lot of them hold PhDs.
And speaking of education, Randolph-Macon has been known as being a strong educational institution, even as it kept its small size. And the Bailey Scholars that I work with, the pre-ministerial students that are here currently at the college, are very strong students. Out of 27 graduates of our program, 8 of them have been Phi Beta Kappa. So it's a very strong tradition of ministerial education and strong liberal arts education here at Randolph-Macon.
Why don't you talk, since you mentioned the Bailey Scholarship, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then we can talk about the program in general, what The pre-ministerial program.
Yeah. Well, the Bailey Scholarship was begun with a generous gift of a friend of L. Purnell Bailey's. Purnell Bailey was a minister, a Methodist minister in Virginia, and this man was not a Methodist, but was very, very fond of Purnell and knew of Purnell's concern that the church was not attracting young clergy. That is, so many of our clergy were second career. And in an effort to encourage young people to consider the ministry, this program was begun with the idea both of nurturing the students along and of helping them graduate from their undergraduate career without a lot of debt, because of course they would be accumulating debt in seminary, and to come out of undergraduate school with a lot of debt was thought to be a deterrent to having students go on to seminary. So the program is very generous in its financial gifts. The students receive half tuition freshman and sophomore years and full tuition junior and senior years, making it one of the most generous scholarships at the college. In addition, the students receive a stipend. They're required to do a summer internship, and they receive a financial stipend for that. And also, they're required to do an academic internship during one of the January terms here at the college. And the students say that those two experiences are the strongest part of the program as far as helping them to discern what they should be doing and where they're being called to ministry. And so the financial assistance and the internships are in conjunction with mentoring by me as the director now, or whoever the director is, and also the peer support and encouragement that they receive, because that's an important part of the program too, is the relationships between the different students in the program.
And are there activities that they do on campus to nurture that?
Well, it tends to be more informal. We do have a meeting once a week. We have a dinner meeting, and that gives time for students to experience fellowship of others who have similar interest to theirs, similar interest in the ministry, because that's not always a very popular vocation. When someone on campus asks you if you know what you want, what area of work you want to go into, and you say the ministry, there's not necessarily a large reception to that idea, or a large enthusiasm, maybe I should say. And so that's why the peer support is so important in this weekly dinner meeting, where the students share with one another and just offer support in general, not just about entering the ministry, but also with their life here on campus. And if things and courses are troubling them, they can discuss those with their other students. And we talk about some of the issues related in the church these days. Recently, in spring of 2014, one of our most spirited discussions was about homosexuality and the church's stance on that and some of the implications of that in the Methodist Church for the clergy and such. And that was a very spirited discussion, very civil, but the students had strong opinions about it, and it was a wonderful meeting where I think everyone left feeling heard and understood and acknowledged that we had different opinions. But again, that peer support is so important for them to be able to discuss issues of ministry that they would not have any other place to discuss it here on campus.
How many scholarships can we give, say, each year?
The program originated offering 6 scholarships a year. We're down to 4 scholarships a year now, obviously for financial reasons, but I'm very grateful. The college has had to supplement what the original gift was, and I'm very grateful to the college for doing that. That has allowed us to maintain those 4 scholarships a year.
Are there one per class or 4
No,
for
4
entering?
each
for,
class.
For entering.
Entering, so
Yeah,
a
that's
total
great.
of 16.
That's wonderful. Mm-hmm.
Yes, piling up debt, of course, is one of the greatest handicaps to higher education now, especially for the parents of minor students.
Right.
But that's a wonderful program, and I'm glad the college is, helping with the financial end of it. Of course, Dr. Moreland used to talk about the historical relationship between the church and the college, specifically the Virginia Conference and Randolph-Macon College. He didn't give equal time to the other institutions.
Well, what would he say? Can you say a little more about what Dr. Moreland would say?
When I was here, they had what was called the Crusade for Christ, whose purpose was to get more diversity in our student body. And we had students from the Asian sector, and the European, and African. In other words, there was always a little bit of undercurrent between the conference and the college, because rural people, country people, hear things about the college that makes them wonder about the advantages of coming. For example, the question of drinking, alcoholic beverages, and that has changed over the years since I have been here.
Absolutely. It used to be very strict Methodist interpretation that Christians were not to drink alcohol.
But I say that there's been a great change in the attitude among the student body and their parents and their grandparents as well. But I think I used to hear criticism about, well, that's a party school or weekend school when the students go elsewhere on the weekends. I don't know how that obtains now, because I've been retired 22 years. And so I don't know whether, I notice there are more students in church now at Duncan Memorial Church. And I think the Bailey scholarships have fostered that. In fact, Bobby Bradshaw was for 2 years sort of an intern with David Heinemann.
Working with youth. Yeah, Bobby
Yes.
Bradshaw. And Jake Scott is doing that now at Duncan Memorial.
Yes.
He's working with the youth. So there's 2 Bailey Scholars.
And I must say that when I was here as a student and as a teacher, there wasn't as much use of Duncan Memorial Church then as it is now. I think right now it's probably the highest it's ever been in my recollection. And I've only, since 1946, I only missed those 16 or 17 years, from being here.
Yeah.
And part of that time I was at Hanover County at Kenwood Methodist Church. And I remember Dr. Moreland used to give these great dinner parties inviting the local clergy and influential citizens. And I think exhausted the fund.
Oh, oh dear.
They don't have as many free meals now, even for the faculty.
Well, Bill, tell us a little bit when you were on campus as a pre-ministerial student, because when you came to Randolph-Macon as a student, you did come with the intention of going in the ministry, you said. So talk about what that the peer relationship was like, and specifically the clericus group that was a support for you.
Well, I came with the first wave of, you might say, the people who had been in the service during World War II, and which meant that we were 3 years older than, the ones that were just entering. In other words, we were the same age as the seniors when we were
And you'd
coming.
been through a lot, yeah.
And many of us had been in combat
Yeah.
because we were in a program called the ASTP, Armored Specialized Training Program, and we were supposed to finish our basic training, and then we would go to college and study engineering. My group was promised we were to go to be a Rambling Rex from Georgia Tech and an engineer. Well, probably a good thing I never was in that program because math was not my strong point. But at any rate, when the invasion occurred, of Europe, they needed a lot of replacements. The ones that were wounded or killed in action, they had to be replaced to prosecute the war. So I finished at Fort Benning in 1944. See, I entered when I was 18 years old, and just barely, that. And so Fort Benning for 3 months, and then they sent us to Camp Livingston, Louisiana. And it was where the mosquitoes took blood samples before they bit you to check the level of your blood. And anyway, it was hot. And we had our maneuvers in the bayous, the Louisiana bayous, between Shreveport, Louisiana, and Shreveport, Texas.
Oh.
Somewhere in no man's land between those two states. But at any rate, yes, many of, that whole STP program, was just wiped out. They just sent half of us to the Pacific, sent another half to Europe. So, and a lot of the people had seen combat, and a number of the people had been chaplains' assistants. They had been corpsmen, medical corpsmen, and they didn't have to have guns, but they had to have all the risks. But and after you've fought in a war, and I don't belong to the party, the super patriot party. I think war results from a failure of diplomacy, and that ever since Clemenceau and Clausewitz, the idea is that war is just a continuation of diplomacy. But the World War II is, I suppose, even bloodier than World War One, which was, pretty terrible, because World War II, after the invasion, ended within a year's time. So, but the people were, had been in combat. They knew about life and death issues. They'd faced, death themselves. And so it gives a different complexion.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, myself included, thought that I had given enough time to help the war effort, and now it was time to help the peace effort.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I figured I'd always considered going into the ministry, but I hadn't decided. And Uncle Sam didn't give me any option.
But when you came, were there quite a few fellows on campus who
yes,
identified?
I was just looking at the 1950 annual, and I counted 30
Wow.
who were students, who were part of the clericals when I graduated.
Mm-hmm.
But not all of those were graduating.
Yes, of all 4 years.
But
mm-hmm.
not everybody came to have their picture taken either.
Mm-hmm. So it's a large group of people.
The figure of 125 being here, 125 ministerial students, seems to me to be perhaps excessive. But I would say, there was a very significant
mm-hmm.
part.
Mm-hmm.
And we met, we had compulsory chapel.
For everyone, all the
For
student
everyone,
body.
Yes. And,
Uh-huh.
I remember Dr. Hatcher was vice president, and he was sort of getting into my age group, octogenarian, and the first time we were in chapel, he said to us, "You're the prettiest group of freshmen we have ever had."
Oh.
And that was to a bunch of veterans. That went over like a lid.
I was going to say that was not taken as a compliment, huh?
A lot of literal-minded
Mm-hmm.
people, but anyway, I went to compulsory chapel, and Dr. Moreland most often spoke, and he always had 3 points and a poem. And first he'd tell you what he's going to tell you, then he told you what he said.
Well, did the students ever lead the chapel? Any of these clericus students ever take a leadership role in the chapel, or was it always faculty?
We were always seated.
Okay, you didn't. They were not leaders, student leaders.
I don't remember anything like that. We had the clericus, which is a Latinate word.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether it originally included all the ministers. I should think it would include anybody who was a clerk.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems to come from that kind of derivation. But at any rate, the clericus was, I know I was president and vice president, and you had to get a lot of speakers,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the problem. But fortunately, we had 2 prominent ministers who were in a battle to see who would be the first bishop from Virginia.
Mm-hmm. So they wanted to come speak.
And they were willing to come, yes.
Was either one of them a Randolph-Macon graduate?
Purnell Bailey was one of them,
Mm-hmm.
and Carl Sanders was the other.
Mm-hmm.
And
Did either of them become the first bishop from Virginia?
well, Carl won the sweepstakes.
Oh.
Carl Sanders. But there have been succession. In fact, somebody in my class, 1950, Hasbrook Hughes,
Mm-hmm.
H.H. Hughes,
Mm-hmm.
he became a bishop. Kern Utzler, C.P. Minnick, there have been a number of
Uh-huh.
Virginia. Was Goodson a Virginian?
I
don't
believe
know.
he was a North Carolinian.
Oh.
I think he was a North
Less
Carolinian.
close.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you had an impressive class of folks who went on to in the ministry then.
And the reason that Randolph-Macon had such a good relationship with the church was Dr. Moreland.
Mm-hmm. Now, he was not ordained. He was not a clergy person, was he?
Well, he had his 3 points in a poem.
But I mean, was he?
A lot of ministers do that too.
But I mean, just as far as background, he was in education, or
He
Yes.
was at college in Latin America,
in
Porto Alegre. I've heard him speak of,
right.
thousands of
Braz-
times.
Is that in Brazil? Was it in Brazil? Bolivia?
Yes, Brazil.
Brazil, right. So
But
he was.
Dr. Moreland was a churchman.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when I graduated from college and seminary, it was the height of the movement in the church called the ecumenical movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Moreland was one of the 5 presidents
Mm-hmm.
of that group. In other words, up there with Karl Barth.
Mm-hmm.
And-
Wow. So he was, a very active churchman.
Oh, yes.
And really promoted the Methodist connection.
And did throughout Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't. Well, I read recently where his will included 4. Well, he had 4 children. They had 4 children.
Mm-hmm.
Each of them got a share, and the college got a share
Mm-hmm.
of his inheritance.
Well, speaking of inheritance and gifts to the college, my understanding, or I know that there is another pre-ministerial scholarship, not just the Bailey Scholarship, and this other scholarship, just simply called the pre-ministerial scholarship, has been active for a long time. I know Ira Andrews, a dearly loved professor here who was also dean of students, received the pre-ministerial scholarship when he was here, and he graduated in 1959. And my understanding is that is half tuition for that scholarship. It does not then increase junior and senior year like the Bailey Scholarship does, but just stays at half tuition the entire 4 years, and it does not require an interview or an application process such as the Bailey Scholarship does.
Yeah.
The pre-ministerial scholarship, you just have to self-declare that you are
sort
interested.
of like the one offered to professors' children.
Mm-hmm. Did you get the pre-ministerial
My
scholarship
son-
when you were here?
No, my son did when he graduated.
He got the professor's half tuition,
Yes.
but there was
I
not
was still teaching that.
right. But there was not a pre-ministerial scholarship when you were here.
Well,
I'm sure there was, but I didn't know.
Oh, you didn't need it
he was
because
on
you
the
had
GI
the GI bill.
Yes.
No, I wouldn't have gotten.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they were.
So you didn't need
They
it.
wanted the full.
Right. The
Uncle
government was
Sam's
paying for
Right.
that. Yeah.
Right. That makes
largesse.
sense.
They wanted all of that.
But I know from looking at the catalog that there are scholarships, named scholarships here at the college that go way back that are specifically designated for those going into the ministry. So the college has received funds to support
They were
its
from the people. They were from the people who didn't go into the ministry. They went. They're like Tom Birdsong.
Mm-hmm.
He took our peanuts and fed them to the hogs, and then made the money on hams.
Right. But we have had a lot
Veal
of
hams.
we have had a lot of generous gifts to the college for pre-ministerial students prior to the large gift that we got for the Bailey program.
Yes, there's always been some people. Well, you know the old joke about if the Lord will keep you humble, the church will keep you poor.
Now, ministry isn't known for being terribly lucrative, so that again is another reason why we wanted the Bailey scholars to graduate without a lot of undergraduate debt, because it would be hard to pay off once they were
Right.
fully employed. They wouldn't be
they have
making enough.
3 more years.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a big problem in education.
right.
now. And the prices are going off the charts.
Well, we talked a little bit about Chappell. Now, You want to talk a little bit about the curriculum requirements have they changed over time when you were a student? Talk about the difference in the requirements.
Every 20 years, or 15, I think it's devolved to now, there's a change of curriculum. That's what we call a new curriculum. When I came to college, I was the part of the first group of a new curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And it required a senior project.
Okay, that started when you came. Okay.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
in 1946. And we had to read books like Arnold Toynbee's A Study of History,
Mm-hmm.
which was 6 volumes, and take a test on it. And I read War and Peace and other tomes at that time. And we had to do a senior project, which was counted for 6 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And it needed, I did mine on Aristotle's theory of the poetics.
Mm-hmm.
I was a Greek major.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I had to remember some of the teachers who were teaching when I was a student here, because I thought we had that was one of the things that recommended Randolph-Macon mostly. First, the ministers in the conference talked it up because a lot of them had come here. And also because the faculty was known to be good,
Mm-hmm.
excellent.
We're talking about education in the ministry. There now, and I assume was not then, but there is no required major of Bailey scholars. They do not have to be religious study majors. They can be any major, and seminaries, as a matter of fact, like for their students, their entering students, to have a broad background. The main thing they want is to know that students can be analytical in their reading and that they can write well and express themselves orally. And I feel like all of those basic skills you get with the liberal arts degree. And here at Randolph-Macon, I'll say that we have a very good reputation at various seminaries for our students being well prepared for seminary. Again, not because of a specific content or major, but because of their ability to express themselves and to be analytical in their reading.
Well, ever since I've been connected with the college, we have emphasized writing and reading.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a program they have a writing center connected with the college, and and we have the Washington Literary Society still, and we used to have the TKA, Wash Frank Hall, 2 groups that would combat each other. That was when I was
The debating
here.
for debates,
Debating.
yes, and we still have a debate team.
Yes,
Very
and
good debate team.
We also had discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Discussion is probably better than debating, because at least in debating you don't come to any unanimity of opinion. In discussions you're supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Something,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like a faculty
Consensus.
meeting
Yeah.
at which nothing is accomplished. No,
But
old presidents never die. They just lose their faculties. And the faculties lose their faculties too.
Well, the college used to have a requirement that all students, not just ministerial students, but all students would take either 2 courses or 2 years, I can't remember which, of Bible. And that requirement eventually evolved into either a course in a major religion or philosophy. But I think back in the day, when Randolph-Macon was founded in even, its first century, for instance, the role of the college was to educate the Sons of the Methodist Church broadly, even people going in, even lay people, but that a basic foundation in Bible would be something that would be expected of an educated lay person coming from a church-related institution.
But of course,
So that's really changed.
when I was here, we were under a new curriculum, and Bible was required. 2 semesters.
Yes, when you were a student, yes.
Yes, Old Testament and New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I came back, we were in the midst of deciding upon a new curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what we did? We joined Bible and philosophy and history were yoked together, and you could take 2 courses in any of those areas. So in other words, it adulterated or it lessened the number of students who would take Bible, because those who were temperamentally opposed to taking Bible, they could easily get into history or philosophy. And so that was, you might say, a little bit of backing down from the biblical precedent. And then since that time, there's been another new curriculum, and I'm sure, but it has a deleterious effect on majors, because if you don't take introductory Bible, you can't take the other subjects on the Bible. It's a prerequisite. So it cuts down the number of majors that you have.
Well,
They've changed some of that too, some of the prerequisites, because
so they can get more special things in.
Yes, and
like
now
education.
and they have it's separated too. The Department of Religious Studies and philosophy are yoked as far as a requirement, not as departments, but as far as a requirement. Students are required to take, I forget if it's 2 or 4 courses out of either of those departments. So you could take all of your requirements in religious studies, all in philosophy, or split it. But
history was with
history's
them
not in that mix
at one time.
Yeah, currently, and I'm not sure of the number of courses, but I know, for instance, there's a course, Life and Letters of Paul. Well, you can take that with never having taken New Testament or Old Testament, for that matter.
Well,
So
that would be a very strange experience.
there's no I think I'm right in saying that. But so
I'm sure you are, because that's what happens when you, we had a lot of courses in Eastern religions and
yes, we have a lot of
Judaism. I
Right.
taught a course on the Holocaust,
yes. That's
and we had colloquies, and I remember I taught Christian mysticism, and the head of the curriculum committee asked me, why would anyone want to take Christian mysticism?
obviously didn't appeal to him.
Did you
Happened
have
to be Mike Wessels, who was psychology. He was in psychology.
Did you have any pre-ministerial students in that course, in the Christian mysticism course?
I had some students that I worked pretty hard, whether they were ministerial or not. That's something else that has happened. When I was a student here, everybody told other people that they were wanting to be ministers, going to church.
Right.
And when I came back, nobody said that, except Episcopal people who were going to the Episcopal clergy. 2 or 3 of them told me they were going to.
And you came back in 1967?
67.
Well, of course, that was little before.
In the time of the New Age.
And of the maybe the American Cultural Revolution, which I know affected the relationship between the college and the church, because during the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement, often students at all colleges, but at Methodist colleges, were very active in those movements, and that created a lot of suspicion with church members, and also not just distrust, but almost dislike of college students, unfortunately. And it took a long time to heal that rift.
Yeah,
The college students were seen as troublemakers.
hippies.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You're speaking of the hippies.
Well, not all of them weren't hippies, but
Well,
the
they
ones
started out with
who were anti-war
Protester, yeah.
and civil rights,
A lot of things.
anti-segregation, that they were seen as real troublemakers, and the church took a long time to warm themselves back up to college students, frankly, because there was a period of time there, not just that college students weren't interested in the church, but that the church was not interested in college students, unfortunately.
Well, with the Duncan Memorial, I've been going there. They always interested. They've been interested in it, but they're more interested in it now.
Mm-hmm.
That we have some that sing in the choir.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're paid to sing in the
Mm-hmm.
choir. And so, and I know David Heinemann has a program, Writing Home to Mother,
Mm-hmm.
tell them that you went to church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That I don't think, when I was in school here, not many people went to, not many students went to church, or the
Not many
old
did?
chapel upstairs.
Mm-hmm. You're saying not many did on Sunday morning?
No,
Interesting.
I
The
think that's
steps
interesting,
were
too.
leaning like this.
Mm-hmm.
Because I would think that back, of course, you were required to go to chapel several times a week, so maybe the students were considering that.
Maybe they thought
they'd done their church.
they'd done their
work. Yeah.
duty.
That's
They
interesting.
probably thought they'd done more.
There's also a connection that a lot of people are not aware of based on pre-ministerial studies, a connection between Randolph-Macon and Duke University, and that is that when Randolph-Macon was begun, pre-ministerial students from Virginia came here, but also pre-ministerial students from the state of North Carolina. And after a period of time, North Carolina decided they wanted their own college, and so Trinity College was started. And then in the mid-1920s, Mr. Duke decided to endow Trinity College, and it became Duke University. But a lot of people aren't aware of that connection between Randolph-Macon and Duke University as far as the foundation. Another interesting piece is that among the Bailey scholars, at least, a lot of the Bailey scholars go to Duke for seminary more than any place else, and I get accused of pushing them in that direction since I'm a graduate, but I have to say I really don't. They just all seem to want to go there, or a lot of them want to go there. So we have a very good reputation at Duke for the preparation of our students.
Mm-hmm. No, there's not a Methodist seminary in Virginia, though, is there?
There is not. There's Wesley Theological Seminary, but that is actually in the District of Columbia.
Okay.
There are seminaries students could attend. Presbyterian Seminary here in Richmond, and also a Baptist Seminary here in Richmond. In the Methodist Church, a seminary has to be approved by what is called the University Senate. Our accreditation body for the Methodist Church's higher education, in order for a student's coursework to be considered for ordination, they can't just go to a Bible institute. They have to go to a accredited seminary. And that's one thing I failed to mention with the Bailey program. There is the requirement that the students will go to 1 year of seminary after they graduate from Randolph-Macon. This does not require that they become ordained or even that they end up working in a church, but they are required to go to 1 year of seminary, or else their loan, the scholarship, the Bailey Scholarship, reverts to a loan. The idea there is that sort of getting students in the door of seminary is a good idea, because that gets them over the hump of, so often students think they have to be perfect or they have to be little angels to go to seminary or whatever, and getting them in the door sometimes helps that mentality change, and they understand a little more about the opportunities that seminary offers.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was wondering what would happen if students, applied for the scholarship, which is very generous, and then, after took the Randolph-Macon diploma and said, "See you later." So that's good that you explained that.
Well, let me say also that the non-Bailey scholarship, the pre-ministerial scholarship that is not part of the Bailey program, does require a student to work in a church 1 year for each year they've received the scholarship. They're not required to be ordained, because, of course, we believe that's between the person and God. So they're not required to be ordained, but they are required to work in a church 1 year for every year they receive the scholarship. And thus, the Bailey program is really a lighter requirement than the basic pre-ministerial scholarship, and that was done intentionally to try to recruit young people into the ministry, as I said before.
Well, after the war, there wasn't a problem recruiting.
Right. But recruiting for the ministry.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
I would like to make a comment here about Ira Andrews, and I know Bill knows him or knew him very well. As I said before, he was a religion professor here and then was asked to be dean of students. But Ira was the chairperson of the Bailey program from its inception until he died last year. And Ira was very instrumental in the strength of the program. His support was just invaluable, and I would be remiss not to mention him.
Well, he had such a long association with the college, coming here as a student, as you said, and I graduated in 1959, and I believe he worked in the church for 3 years.
Yes, he did.
And then came back. And Jarrett. Oh, I didn't know that.
Sitting there at church in Jarrett.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Bill and I have a commonality in Sussex County, Virginia.
Oh.
But I didn't know that's where he had been. But then he, came back and taught here and was dean of students, for 40 years. And I think is probably mentioned in almost every Macon Memory interview I've done. I don't think there's one that hasn't mentioned Ira in some capacity. Such an influence. Any other thoughts about the college's mission for preparing students for ministry?
I would like to say a little more about the period in which people did not declare that they were ministers, were going to be ministers.
Mm-hmm.
Why that? Mm-hmm. And I know they changed, cultural changes in the 60s may have been, but that still pretty much obtains, except for the Bailey Scholarship.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's not something that students go around broadcasting. If asked,
I guess they think
that.
They might be miss opportunities if they
or ridiculed for it,
yes.
Because that has happened, not often, but students will tell me at times that has happened. Like, what in the world are you thinking? What do you want to do that for? Mm-hmm. Just a total misunderstanding of what ministry involves, and a ridicule, really, for a student who is a pre-ministerial student. But that's very rare. That's not the average encounter a student has here on campus.
Of course, we have the atheistic movement has a new life.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Very much. And
They are a group of outstanding scientists and philosophers who are taking that stand.
Right. Right. And the general, but I want to say culture on the campus, as we've said, does not really support religious involvement of any kind, not just pre-ministerial capacity, but there's the religious preference cards that the chaplain here receives every fall from the entering class. The largest group now is no preference. That is students who don't have any affiliation with any denomination or any religion. They check the no preference box, and that's the largest group now, which is certainly a change.
Well, I was teaching a course in New Testament, and one student raised his hand and said, "What does the word gospel mean?"
My daughter tells stories like that. My daughter, that graduated in 2006, was a art history major, and being the child of two parents, she knew Bible stories. And of course, so much of art history is depictions, at least in the past 2 millennia, not in antiquity, but the past 2 millennia have been depictions of biblical stories. And Liz would laugh and tell me she was the only one in the class who would recognize the prodigal son or Daniel in the lion's den or any well-known Bible story, that the other students just didn't know them.
that's also a problem apparently in students reading literature. If they don't understand the Bible references or miss. Well, even people going to the movies. I've tried to get my children a little bit interested in the Bible, just to say you're not going to get the references in the movies if you don't know the Bible stories.
That's true.
Yeah. Of course, when you teach Bible to people of all denominations or no denominations, you can retreat into what you could call the academic study of Scripture.
And that is the difference between an undergraduate education, at least at a school like Randolph-Macon, and a seminary education. While seminary is still very academic and rigorous, but there also is an inclusion of contemporary meaning and how might this impact your life and or your ministry. So seminary education takes a little different turn on that, whereas undergraduate education religious education tends to be very academic and not in the vein of personal encounter.
Well, it depends on the minister. Some ministers are more evangelical than others.
Right. I was just talking about seminary education as opposed to undergraduate education.
Well, sometimes in seminary, these high-powered philosophers sometimes go over the head of the seminary students.
Well, that happens too.
I heard Paul Tillich's lectures on the courage to be when I was a freshman at Yale, and
Weren't you fortunate?
I said, I guess the professors understood what he was saying. Of course, they spoke in a guttural accent.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming and shedding so much light on the rich history the college has for training young people for ministry and training the children of ministers. And thank you for coming and being with Making Memories today.
Well, certain. Thank you
I
for the
enjoyed it.
opportunity.